A week before Christmas, I stood in the wide hallway of my dad's house in Greenwich, my coat still buttoned and my overnight bag resting at my feet. The place looked like a photograph from a glossy magazine. Garland wrapped every banister, wreaths hung in every window. The scent of pine and expensive candles filled the air. I should have felt warmth, but instead my chest tightened with the old familiar weight of not belonging. I was 34 years old, and yet every time I crossed that threshold, I was reduced to a girl waiting for permission to exist. I had just come in from the cold when I heard voices carrying from the library. My dad's voice, deep and deliberate, drifted through the cracked door. Richard Jackson always spoke as if the world were a boardroom and he was the chairman. Elaine's lighter voice floated after him, sharp, with that ever-present note of satisfaction. I froze, one gloved hand still on the banister. My dad said something about the guest list and the importance of this dinner. His tone was triumphant, the way he always sounded when he thought about deals and power. Elaine, my stepmother, responded, amused, her laugh low and confident. Then I heard my name. I leaned closer, my pulse quickening. He said he had told his friends not to worry, that Bianca would handle the cooking and serving. He chuckled softly, saying at least I was good for something. Elaine agreed, adding that Chloe should never be expected to lift a finger, that she was meant to shine in front of important people, not hide in a kitchen. My skin prickled. I pressed my back to the wall, clutching my coat tighter. They were planning to use me as the maid for 40 guests, 40 of his most influential business associates. He was boasting that his eldest daughter would ensure everything was perfect, while Chloe, the daughter of his second marriage, would entertain with her charm and wit. My stepmother murmured that people respected a family that knew their roles. He agreed. Then they laughed together, the sound like shards of glass in my ears. I felt heat rush to my face, shame mixing with fury. For years I had let their words slide over me, convincing myself that silence was easier. I had cooked, cleaned, arranged flowers, smiled politely when they dismissed me between jobs, invisible except when needed. But standing there in the hall, hearing them plot like I was hired help, something in me snapped. I pulled my bag closer and took a slow breath, the kind I learned to take when anger threatened to break me. My dad's baritone carried on about which wine should be opened first. Elaine chimed in about her Waterford crystal, both of them so sure I would do exactly as told. My hands trembled, but not from fear. This time it was different. I thought of the life I had built in New York, the company that bore no trace of the Jackson name, the team of 70 employees who called me boss with respect and loyalty. They had no idea. He believed I spent my days in a tiny apartment drifting between jobs. My stepmother introduced me as the daughter who had not quite found her path. Chloe smirked when I arrived at family events, whispering that at least I could make myself useful with appetizers. I leaned closer to the door once more. Her voice lowered, conspiratorial. She said the guests would be impressed to see Chloe front and center, radiant in her gown, while Bianca handled everything behind the scenes. My dad answered that it was fitting, since one daughter was meant for success and the other for service. The words landed heavy and cold. I felt them settle in my bones like stones. I pressed my lips together until they hurt. In that moment, I understood with piercing clarity that no matter what I achieved in the world, within these walls I would always be the servant they wanted me to be. Unless I decided otherwise. A floorboard creaked under my boot and I startled, afraid they had heard me. The voices inside paused, then picked up again unconcerned. I backed away slowly, retreating toward the staircase. My dad's laugh followed me, confident, certain of my obedience. He had no idea his eldest daughter was standing just feet away, finally awake to the truth. I climbed the stairs with measured steps, the weight of my bag in my hand grounding me. At the landing I paused, looking over the railing at the decorated tree in the foyer. Dozens of ornaments glittered, each one chosen by my stepmother to project perfection. I remembered Christmases long ago when my mother was alive, how the tree was a hodgepodge of paper stars and clay angels I had made in school. After she passed, everything homemade disappeared, replaced by crystals and polished silver. My childhood erased one ornament at a time. I reached the guest room, the one my mother always directed me to when I visited. It was immaculate, sterile, a room that belonged to no one. I set my bag on the bed and sat down heavily, my chest rising and falling with anger. My dad and stepmother were downstairs plotting to use me like staff, laughing at the certainty of my compliance. I pressed my palms against my knees and forced myself to breathe. The temptation to storm into the library and confront them was strong. But no, I told myself, not this time. Their laughter still echoed in my ears, but for once it did not reduce me. It lit something inside me instead, a steady flame of defiance. I could already feel the shape of a different plan forming, one that would shatter their assumptions. Downstairs, a clock chimed the hour. The sound carried through the quiet house. I realized I was gripping the handle of my suitcase with white knuckles. Slowly, I loosened my hold. I stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the snow beginning to fall. The lawn stretched wide and perfect, but beyond it lay the city where my true life waited. The glass fogged slightly with my breath. I whispered to myself the words barely audible, that I was done being the maid of this family. My reflection in the pane stared back, eyes sharper than I remembered. I turned from the window and unzipped my bag. Inside, neatly folded, was the dark blazer I wore for board meetings, the kind of clothing my dad never imagined I would need. I ran my fingers over the fabric, feeling the strength of what I had built. The voices from the library rose again, a burst of laughter drifting up the stairs. My chest tightened, but this time not with shame. It was resolved. I sat on the edge of the bed, blazer draped across my lap, and let the silence settle. The house that once held every piece of my childhood felt foreign now, like a stage where I had been cast in a role I never agreed to play. My dad believed the script was set, but I knew better. A week before Christmas, while the snow fell quietly over Greenwich, I understood that the time had come to step out of the shadows of this family. The plan was already forming, clear and unstoppable, and nothing would ever be the same. When I closed my eyes that night in the sterile guest room, memories I had long tried to bury came flooding back. It was as if hearing my dad and stepmother laugh downstairs had unlocked a door inside me, one I had kept bolted for more than 2 decades. I remembered the winter of 2010, when my mother died suddenly and everything about my world shifted. I was 20 years old then, old enough to understand loss, but too young to grasp how completely it would reshape my life. The house was filled with casseroles from neighbors and the hollow sound of whispered condolences. I stayed up through the night, sorting through her clothes, touching the sleeves of sweaters that still smelled like her perfume. And within 6 months, my dad remarried. My stepmother swept into our lives with her designer dresses and her smooth laugh that always carried a hint of condescension. She had a daughter, Chloe, 4 years younger than me, and from the moment they moved in, the balance of our household tilted. My dad beamed with pride whenever he spoke about her social connections, her flair for entertaining. He introduced Chloe as a bright, promising girl destined for success. I, on the other hand, became useful only for keeping things running in the background. I could still hear her voice telling me to set the table properly for her book club ladies. She said it in that sing-song tone that made the command sound like a favor. I obeyed because I was grieving, because I thought keeping peace was the only way to hold on to what little family I had left. Chloe sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone while I polished silverware. She would laugh and tell me not to look so serious, that I should be grateful I had a role at all. As the years passed, the pattern hardened. My dad paid for Chloe's private university, sent her on study abroad programs, even bought her a car when she turned 21. When I asked for help with graduate school, he frowned and said it was not a wise investment. He told me I needed to be realistic about my limitations. Those words stuck in my chest like splinters. I remember one Thanksgiving when I was 25. She was hosting 30 people and I spent 2 full days in the kitchen. I basted turkeys, whipped potatoes, layered pies, and by the time the guests arrived, I was covered in flour and sweat. She paraded Chloe in a sequined dress, announcing her internship at a Manhattan firm, while I carried platters into the dining room without being introduced. My dad boasted about Chloe's prospects, and when someone asked what I did, he waved a hand and said I was between opportunities. The laughter around the table burned hotter than the ovens behind me. Neighbors noticed too. Grace Johnson, the elderly woman next door, once caught me shoveling snow from the driveway while Chloe posed in the yard for holiday pictures. Grace shook her head and muttered that she did not understand why my dad made me do everything. I shrugged, too conditioned to defend myself. Later, she pressed a tin of cookies into my hand and told me I deserved better. It was one of the few gestures of kindness that Winter and I held on to it. Sitting in that guest room now, more than a decade later, I traced the patterns of those years in my mind. I had been erased bit by bit until only a shadow of me remained inside this house. Even the room where I had once painted the walls lavender and pinned my high school debate ribbons had been gutted. My stepmother transformed it into Chloe's dressing room, with mirrored closets and racks of clothes. My trophies and books were stuffed into boxes in the basement out of sight. I remembered the sting of opening that door the first time, expecting to step back into my childhood sanctuary, only to find it claimed and redesigned. Chloe had smiled, saying she needed the space more than I did. My dad nodded as if it were obvious. He told me to stop clinging to the past. He said a storage box was more than enough for my keepsakes. I did not argue. I just felt myself shrink a little smaller, the way a plant withers in the dark. As I stared at the blank walls of the guest room, my chest ached with the weight of those old humiliations. But something was different now. The humiliation no longer consumed me. It sharpened into clarity. Each memory, painful as it was, reminded me of how far I had come outside of these walls. In New York, I was not the invisible daughter. I was a leader, a woman who signed contracts worth millions, who guided a staff that trusted me. None of them knew this hidden chapter of my life, the chapter where I was the forgotten servant in my dad's home. The sound of laughter drifted up again from the library, snapping me back to the present. My dad and stepmother were still talking, no doubt refining the details of their perfect evening. I pressed my palms against the bedspread and drew a long breath. My dad believed that people respected a family who knew their roles. To him, Chloe would always be the star, and I would always be the maid. He could not imagine a world where the roles might change. My pulse quickened as I thought of the Christmas dinner to come. 40 guests seated in polished chairs, the crystal gleaming. Chloe holding court with her rehearsed charm. My dad would puff his chest and call her his pride, while she preened beside him. And me, he expected, would sweat in the kitchen, invisible except when carrying plates. I looked at my suitcase, still half-packed, and the sight of it gave me comfort. It was a reminder that I had a choice. The girl who swallowed every insult, who quietly cleaned and cooked and smiled, was gone. I felt a steadiness rise inside me, a voice that said enough. I stood and crossed to the window again. Snowflakes swirled in the dark, catching the glow of the lampposts. Beyond the gates of this house was a life I had built on my own terms. The contrast was stark. Inside these walls, I was trapped in the role of a servant. Outside, I was free to be who I truly was. For a long moment, I let myself feel the sting of the past one last time. The paper stars my mother had once hung on the Christmas tree. The nights I cried alone after Elaine dismissed my dreams. The way Chloe smirked when I was sent to fetch her a drink. Each memory cut, but each one also fueled me. I turned from the window, my decision hardening like ice underfoot. Richard might believe he had written my role forever, but he had no idea how ready I was to rewrite the script, and for the first time in my life, I could almost smile at the thought of surprising him. The morning after that long night in Greenwich, I unlocked the door to my apartment in Manhattan and stepped into a world that felt entirely my own. The difference between my dad's house and my life here was almost comical. There, I was still the invisible daughter meant to carry trays and polish silver. Here I was, Bianca Jackson, founder and chief executive officer of Prestige Events, a company I had built from scratch with nothing but grit and a handful of savings. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air. My assistant had stopped by early, leaving a carafe on the counter as she often did when I was away overnight. I slipped off my heels, letting the city's hum drift through the windows. The skyline was gray and cold, but instead of feeling small, I felt powerful. This was the view I had earned. I walked past the framed photographs that lined my hallway. They told a story no one in my family had ever cared to ask about. There was one of me standing with my team at the opening of our Dallas branch, all of us smiling in front of the company's name written in bold across the glass. Another showed Maria, my head chef, lifting a champagne flute after landing a new luxury client. My staff called me boss with pride, their faith in me steady and unshakable. 7 years ago, none of this existed. In 2017, I was 27 years old, waitressing nights and sketching ideas for a catering business in the margins of my notebooks. I took every dollar I had, just $5,000, and rented a small kitchen space. I told no one in my family. I could already hear my dad's laughter, Elaine's dismissive shrug. Instead, I quietly poured myself into work, booking small events, then larger ones, slowly gathering a reputation for precision and elegance. Now we had 70 employees across 4 cities, and in less than a week, I was scheduled to fly to Miami to finalize a contract with Summit Global, Incorporated. It was worth $3.5 million, a partnership that would secure us for years to come. My dad thought I was barely making rent in a studio apartment. The irony was sharper than any blade. I hung my coat and powered on my laptop. Emails flooded in, holiday events needing last-minute adjustments, staff asking for confirmations. Among them was the one I had been waiting for, a message from Daniel Hayes, Chief Executive Officer of Summit Global. He confirmed our dinner on December 25th and the boardroom presentation the following morning. He wrote that he admired how Prestige Events had expanded without outside investors or family connections, calling it rare and refreshing. I leaned back in my chair, letting his words sink in. Daniel had no idea the depth of truth in that statement. No family connections, no inheritance, only the steady push of my own will. I wondered what he would say if he knew that at that very moment my dad was boasting to friends that I would be serving them food like a housemaid. The phone buzzed and Maria's voice filled the line. She wanted to double-check the flight schedule, worried about delays in holiday travel. I assured her I would be in Miami on time. She hesitated, then said softly that she and the staff were proud of me, that this contract was a turning point. I thanked her, my throat tightening with gratitude. Maria had been with me since the early days, long before there were multiple branches or glossy magazine spreads. She knew the sacrifices I had made. After the call, I walked to the closet where I kept my work suits. Hanging there was the navy blazer I always wore for major meetings. I ran my hand along the fabric, steadying myself. The girl scrubbing dishes in Greenwich had been me once, but the woman standing in front of this closet was not that girl anymore. My mind flickered back to Richard's voice the night before, telling Elaine that Chloe was the star while I was the servant. He had no idea that while Chloe was posing in borrowed gowns, I was negotiating contracts with some of the biggest corporations in the country. He did not know that Forbes had already interviewed me for their 40 under 40 issue, or that hospitality magazines had called me the quiet revolutionary of luxury events. I sat at the dining table scrolling through my calendar. December was packed. High-end parties in New York, corporate galas in Chicago, a wedding in Miami scheduled for New Year's Eve. Yet I had carved out time for this summit deal because it was the pinnacle, the opportunity that would define the next decade for prestige. For a moment, I let myself imagine Richard's face if he could see this calendar, if he could hear Daniel Hayes call me a partner. But then I pushed the thought aside. His approval had never been part of the equation. What mattered was the company I had built, the employees whose livelihoods depended on it, the clients who trusted me. The city outside roared to life, sirens in the distance, car horns echoing up the avenues. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching the steam rise. The bitterness of last night lingered, but it no longer had the power to crush me. Instead, it hardened my resolve. My dad and stepmother might laugh at me behind closed doors, but soon enough the truth would no longer be hidden. I carried the cup to the window and looked down at the streets, the streams of people bundled in coats carrying shopping bags, rushing through the holiday season. Somewhere below, life went on indifferent to my family drama. But inside me, the contrast between who I was at home and who I was here was impossible to ignore. I set the cup down and opened my laptop again. Another email arrived, this one from a magazine editor confirming they wanted a full feature on prestige events in January. They called it a story of resilience. I smiled faintly. Resilience was one word for it. Survival was another. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater. I glanced at my suitcase still by the door, the same one I had carried to Greenwich. It struck me that the bag had become more than luggage. It was a symbol of choice, the line between two worlds. One where I was trapped in a role written by others, and one where I commanded my own story. The thought made me breathe easier. Outside the window, the sky began to lighten, streaks of pale blue cutting through the gray. The city was waking fully now, and with it, so was I. The phone rang late that afternoon as I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the Miami presentation. My dad's name flashed on the screen. I hesitated, my thumb hovering above the decline button. Against my better judgment, I answered. His voice was sharp-clipped without preamble. He told me I needed to be back in Greenwich by Thursday morning. He said the guest list had grown to 40, including several investors he had been courting all year. He said the responsibility of the meal fell on me, as if it were as natural as breathing. I closed my eyes and counted to 3 before I responded. I told him I had business commitments. I told him I could not simply abandon my schedule to cook and serve for his friends. For a moment there was silence on the line, then his laugh, cold and dismissive, spilled through the receiver. He said nothing I had to do could possibly be more important than family. I pressed my hand against my chest, steadying my breath. He went on saying Chloe needed to be free to dazzle, that Elaine had carefully curated the evening, and that I was expected to follow through. I reminded him I was not a maid. His tone sharpened like a blade. He told me if I refused, then I should not bother calling myself part of the family any longer. The words hung heavy, but instead of cutting me, they hardened me. I said quietly that I understood. Before he could launch into another tirade, I ended the call. My heart thudded, but my hands were steady. I stared at the dark screen, and for the first time in years, I did not feel small after hearing his voice. I felt free. Moments later, my phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Elaine. She attached a detailed list of dishes, 7 courses, side plates, desserts, wine pairings. Each note carried a sharp undertone, as if she were warning me not to embarrass her. I set the phone face down on the table, the vibrations continuing until they finally stopped. Not long after Chloe chimed in with her own message, she reminded me how important this night was for our dad's reputation. She wrote that I should be grateful to help, that it was the least I could do given all the family had done for me. I nearly laughed. All the family had done for me amounted to stripping my room, dismissing my ambitions, and turning me into background labor. I rose from the table, walked to the window, and looked out at the city lights beginning to flicker on. In New York, I was respected, valued, seen. In Greenwich, I was invisible unless I was carrying a tray. The contrast was unbearable. My dad's ultimatum still echoed in my ears, but instead of binding me, it broke something open. I walked to the closet, pulled out my suitcase, and set it on the bed. I folded blouses and suits with deliberate care, each piece a reminder of the life I had built beyond his shadow. As I packed, my mind replayed his words that if I left, I should not come back. The threat that once would have terrified me now sounded hollow. My phone rang again. Chloe's name glowed. Against my better judgment, I answered. Her voice was shrill, coated with the entitlement she had always worn like perfume. She said Mom was furious Dad was pacing, and I needed to stop being difficult. I told her calmly that I was not coming. She sputtered, insisting I was being selfish, that the entire evening hinged on me. I almost pitied her panic, but I kept my tone level. She demanded to know what could possibly be more important than Christmas Eve with family. I thought of the Miami boardroom, the contract that would secure jobs for 70 employees, the chance to finally step fully into the light. I told her I had business. She laughed cruelly, calling it make-believe. My hand tightened on the phone, but I did not falter. I repeated that I would not be there. Her voice rose to a screech. She said I would ruin everything, that Mom would never forgive me, that Dad would cut me off forever. I listened until she was out of breath, then simply said goodbye and hung up. My fingers trembled slightly, but the tremor was not from fear. It was the release of years of submission finally giving way. I zipped the suitcase closed and sat on the edge of the bed. The apartment was silent, except for the hum of the heater. Outside, snowflakes drifted under the streetlights. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt no dread about disappointing my dad. What I felt was clarity. He had expected me to fold, to rush back to Greenwich with my head down, ready to cook and clean while Chloe basked in attention. Instead, I had chosen myself. I glanced at the ticket on my desk, the flight to Miami already confirmed. My decision was final. The phone remained silent for a few minutes, then lit up again with my dad's name. I let it ring until it stopped. I knew what he would say. I knew the threats, the guilt, the accusations. None of it mattered anymore. The role they had written for me was ending. I stood, pulled my suitcase upright, and wheeled it to the front door. The sound of the wheels on the hardwood was like a punctuation mark. My heart beat steady, not frantic, as if my body already knew I was walking toward freedom. I paused there, hand on the handle, and let the silence of the apartment wrap around me. The voices from Greenwich were still faint in my memory, sharp with command and derision. But here in my home, I could hear something else rising, something stronger. It was my own voice, clear and certain. I whispered into the quiet that I was done. Done playing the maid. Done being invisible. Done letting their threats dictate my choices. The words settled into me like an oath. I turned off the lights, the suitcase standing ready by the door. Tomorrow would bring more calls, more pleas or threats, but tonight, for the first time, I felt untouchable. The next morning dawned gray and quiet, the kind of winter day where the city seemed wrapped in its own breath. I woke early, pulled my suitcase into the living room, and brewed a pot of coffee. My phone sat face down on the counter, buzzing every few minutes with calls I already knew were from Greenwich. I refused to pick up. I could almost picture my dad pacing in his study, Elaine snapping at the staff, Chloe rehearsing excuses in the mirror. Their chaos no longer belonged to me. Instead, I spread my notes across the dining table and reviewed every line of my Miami presentation. Charts, client testimonials, financial projections, photos from our most polished events. Each page told a story of grit and success, a story they had never cared to hear. My team's faces looked back at me from glossy prints, their trust in me more powerful than any threat from my dad. By noon, Maria stopped by carrying a folder of final catering adjustments for a wedding we were managing that weekend. She set it on the table, then studied my expression. She asked if I was all right. I told her what had happened in Greenwich, about overhearing my dad's plan to parade me as a servant. Her jaw tightened, and she muttered that she would have quit on the spot if she had been in my shoes. She reminded me that I was the reason dozens of families had stable jobs and secure futures. She said no family's arrogance could erase that. Her loyalty steadied me more than she could know. After she left, I sat quietly, replaying the moment my dad had told me not to bother coming back. His words had once been a sentence, but now they sounded like a door closing behind me, leaving me free to walk forward. I opened my laptop to an email from Daniel Hayes' assistant confirming my itinerary in Miami. They had booked a dinner suite at the resort for Christmas Eve, followed by the board meeting at 9 the next morning. Daniel wrote a personal note at the end saying he admired how I had built prestige events without help, calling it rare to see such independence. I stared at the words, feeling the weight of them settle deep. No one had ever admired me for independence before. Later in the afternoon, I forced myself to turn the phone over and scroll through the texts. Elaine's were sharp and icy, accusing me of betrayal, saying I was abandoning family. Chloe's grew more frantic as the hours passed, veering from insults to pleading. At one point, she offered me $200 to cook the dinner, as if my time were worth that to her. I almost laughed. My staff charged $5,000 for private services, and still our calendar was booked months in advance. The ignorance of their assumptions was staggering. Then came a message from my dad. It was short, just 3 sentences. He said if I humiliated him this way, I would regret it. He said I was throwing away the last shred of family loyalty. He said he would cut me out completely. I stared at it for a long moment, then deleted it without answering. As the sky darkened, I packed the last of my things into the suitcase. My navy blazer, the one I always wore for major contracts, hung freshly pressed on the closet door. The apartment felt calm, almost like it was holding me steady. Outside, snow fell lightly, dusting the fire escapes and rooftops. I poured a glass of wine and sank into the sofa, the suitcase waiting near the door. The city hummed below, a comfort in its indifference. For the first time in years, Christmas did not mean servitude. It meant choice. It meant freedom. But even as I tried to breathe in that peace, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail from Chloe. Against my better judgment, I pressed play. Her voice was shaky, panicked. She said Mom had invited a very important guest, someone from the hospitality industry, someone who could open doors for her career. She begged me not to ruin it. Then her voice broke as she said Victoria Chen, Chief Executive Officer of Summit Global, would be attending. The glass slipped slightly in my hand, and I had to steady it against the arm of the sofa. Victoria Chen, the very same woman I was scheduled to meet in Miami. The coincidence hit me like a shockwave. My dad expected me to serve her at his dinner table while pretending to be unemployed, when in truth I was flying to negotiate a multi-million-dollar contract with her. I set the glass down, my heart pounding. The absurdity was almost laughable, but the danger was real. If I showed up in Greenwich, I would be invisible again, the servant daughter. If I stayed the course, I would arrive in Miami as Victoria's equal, a partner. The contrast could not be sharper. I stood and walked to the window, pressing my hand against the cold glass. Below, people hurried through the snow, their coats pulled tight, their faces flushed from the wind. They looked purposeful, moving toward something. I realized I was doing the same. My dad's world and my world were colliding in a way he could never have imagined. The phone buzzed again with another text from Chloe. She warned me not to embarrass her, not to say anything stupid in front of Victoria. My lips curved into a bitter smile. She had no idea that I had already built a reputation with Victoria's company, that I had already catered their corporate retreats, that Victoria herself had been impressed by our precision and discretion. I closed the blinds and returned to the suitcase. My choice was made, but now the stakes were even higher. If I succeeded in Miami, the truth would come out whether I said a word or not. If I failed, my dad's narrative of me as useless and invisible might never be shaken. The clock ticked toward evening, each minute louder in the silence of the apartment. I poured the last of the wine down the sink and rinsed the glass. My body felt steady, but inside my thoughts whirled. Christmas Eve was approaching, and with it, a collision of past and future I could not avoid. I switched off the lights and stood in the quiet, my suitcase upright by the door. Somewhere in Connecticut, my family was plotting an evening built on appearances and lies. Here in Manhattan, I was preparing to reveal the truth without even trying. The night stretched long ahead, and I knew sleep would not come easily. The air felt charged, as if the city itself knew what was about to unfold. I lowered myself onto the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled hum of traffic below. In the stillness, one thought rose above all others. When Victoria saw me next, it would not be as a servant in my dad's dining room. It would be as the woman who built an empire they had all refused to see. Snow was falling in soft sheets the night I wheeled my suitcase into the lobby of the resort in Miami. The air smelled faintly of salt and pine garlands, the hotel decorated with understated holiday elegance. I signed my name at the reception desk, and the clerk handed me a key card with a smile that told me my room had been prepared with care. My heels clicked against the marble as I followed a bellman to the elevator, each sound echoing the certainty of my choice. When the doors opened on the 12th floor, the corridor stretched wide and hushed. My suite overlooked the Atlantic waves rolling dark under the winter moon. On the table near the window sat a bottle of champagne on ice with a handwritten note. "Welcome to Miami, looking forward to tomorrow, Victoria." The loops of her signature were bold and deliberate. I traced my finger across the paper, feeling the weight of what tomorrow meant. I showered away the cold of travel, then dressed in a soft robe, letting myself breathe. The flight had been smooth, but the storm raging in Connecticut still clung to me. My phone showed nearly 30 missed calls, a cascade of texts from my dad and Chloe. I ignored them, placing the device face down on the nightstand. The silence that followed was louder than their words. At 7 sharp, I headed downstairs for the private dinner arranged by Summit Global. The dining room was warm and filled with the low hum of conversation. Executives greeted me with handshakes, their smiles measured but curious. They had heard my name for years, but tonight they finally met the woman behind Prestige Events. I returned their greetings with practiced ease, though inside my pulse quickened with every glance at the door, wondering when Victoria would arrive. The first course had just been served when she entered. Victoria Chen moved with calm authority, her black dress simple yet commanding. She smiled when her eyes found me, and for a moment the noise of the room dimmed. She crossed the floor and shook my hand firmly, her gaze steady. She thanked me for coming during the holidays, her tone warm but direct. I told her it was my honor, and for once I meant every word. Through the courses, we spoke of logistics, of how Prestige handled simultaneous events across cities, of how my chefs trained to maintain consistency without sacrificing creativity. Victoria asked thoughtful questions, probing deeper than most clients ever dared. She wanted to know about my beginnings, about how I had managed to scale without family backing. I answered honestly, telling her about late nights in borrowed kitchens, about reinvesting every dime instead of taking on investors, about choosing silence when my family doubted me. Her expression softened. She said that resilience mattered more to her than pedigree. She said she valued people who built their own foundation, who understood what it meant to be overlooked yet kept moving. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if she somehow knew, if the Greenwich dinner had already unraveled, if she suspected my connection. But she only raised her glass and said she admired the way I had built something from nothing. As the evening wound down, her assistant approached with a reminder of tomorrow's schedule. 9 o'clock sharp in the boardroom, followed by contract review and signing. Victoria turned to me and asked if I was ready. I smiled, though my chest tightened. I told her I had been preparing for years. Back in the suite, I changed into pajamas and sat by the window, staring out at the water. My phone buzzed again, a message from Chloe this time. It said disaster, followed by a flurry of frantic words. Mom had promised a lavish dinner, but with no caterer available. The kitchen was still bare. Guests had begun to arrive, including Victoria, who had flown in before heading to Miami. My stomach dropped, the coincidence cutting sharper than before. I read every word, slowly piecing together the scene. Chloe said Elaine was near tears, Dad was red with fury, and the guests were restless. She said Victoria looked unimpressed that the entire night was falling apart. I set the phone down, hands trembling. The thought of Victoria sitting in my dad's dining room watching him stumble, hearing him complain about me, was almost unbearable. But then something shifted. If Victoria had seen that chaos, she would understand the truth of who they were. And tomorrow, when she sat across from me in a boardroom, she would also see the truth of who I was. The clock ticked past midnight as I lay in bed, the sound of the ocean steady against the glass. I thought of the mahogany table in Greenwich, pizza boxes scattered where crystal once gleamed, my dad's voice growing desperate as he tried to spin excuses. For years I had feared disappointing him. Now the thought of his embarrassment carried no weight. His lies had finally collapsed under their own arrogance. Sleep came in fitful waves. When dawn broke, pale light spilling across the water, I rose and dressed carefully. The navy blazer slid over my shoulders like armor. My notes were stacked neatly in my briefcase, every page rehearsed until it felt like second nature. At 8:30, I walked through the resort's corridors toward the boardroom. My heels struck against the carpeted floor, each step measured steady. The air smelled faintly of coffee and fresh flowers. A staff member opened the door for me, and I entered to find the Summit Global team already assembled, folders open, pens poised. Victoria sat at the head of the table. She looked up as I entered, her eyes lingering for a beat too long. I took my seat, folded my hands, and met her gaze without wavering. The assistant leaned in to whisper something to her, and she glanced at her phone. For a moment, her expression shifted, the faintest flicker of recognition crossing her face. She looked back at me, then at the screen, then back at me again. My breath caught, but I forced my expression to remain calm. The silence in the room grew heavy, charged with something no one else yet understood. Victoria laid her phone on the table, turned it toward me, and the image glowed bright. It was a photograph from my parents' dining room pizza boxes stacked high, my mother flushed with humiliation, my dad's mouth half empty. In the background, half hidden, was the family portrait they had insisted on hanging last Thanksgiving. And there I was, blurred but visible, standing behind Chloe as if I had been an afterthought. Victoria's voice was quiet, measured, but every syllable cut through the stillness. "Is this your family?" I nodded once, my throat dry, my pulse hammering. The room waited, pens still, eyes shifting between us. The moment I had feared and anticipated had arrived, and there was no retreat. "Yes, Victoria," I said, my voice steady though my chest tightened. "That is my family. Margaret and Richard Jackson are my parents. Chloe is my half-sister." The silence that followed was absolute. The executives shifted in their seats, eyes flicking between me and the glowing image of my parents' ruined dinner party. Victoria's gaze stayed fixed on me, her expression unreadable. She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. "Last night," she said slowly, "your mother told every guest that her older daughter was unstable and irresponsible, that she had abandoned them in their time of need. She claimed her daughter had no real job and could barely keep an apartment." I waited, forcing myself not to flinch. Victoria tilted her head, studying me. "That daughter was you, wasn't it?" I nodded again. "Yes." Her laugh startled the room. It was not cruel, but filled with a kind of disbelief that bordered on wonder. "So let me be clear," she said. "The woman I saw last night, serving pizza in China and blaming her invisible daughter, had no idea that the same daughter is the founder of Prestige Events, the company I have been trying to partner with for years." One of the executives, a tall man with silver hair, leaned forward. "Is that true, Bianca?" I met his gaze. "It is. They never asked about my work. They assumed I had failed, and I let them keep believing it." Victoria tapped the screen with her finger, the photo trembling slightly on the table. "Do they really not know about your company, that you employ 70 people? That you have offices in 4 cities? That you are about to sign a contract worth millions?" "They have no idea," I said quietly. A murmur spread through the room, disbelief mixing with curiosity. James Carter Summit's legal counsel set down his pen. "The very idea that your parents treated you as help when you could have catered their event at a level they cannot even imagine." I let his words hang. The truth had filled the room, now undeniable and sharp. Victoria stood walking to the window before turning back to face me. She said, "You chose not to show up last night. You chose to honor your commitments here instead of playing their servant." "That is correct," I replied. Her smile was small, but it carried weight. "Good. That tells me everything I need to know about your priorities." The tension in my chest loosened slightly, though the air in the room remained charged. One of the other executives whispered something to a colleague, the words impossible to catch, but their eyes were on me, measuring, reassessing. Victoria returned to her seat and placed her phone face down on the table. She gestured toward my portfolio. "Show us," she said simply. I opened the folder, my hands steady now, and began to speak. I described our operations, our logistics, the way we manage simultaneous high-profile events with precision. I showed photos of gala dinners, conferences, and charity balls. I laid out testimonials from clients who trusted us year after year. As I spoke, I felt the shift in the room. The skepticism melted into interest, then into admiration. By the time I finished, the executives were leaning forward, questions tumbling one after another. How do you manage staff turnover? How do you maintain quality control across states? How did you scale without capital? Each question was a chance to peel back another layer to reveal the strength they had never seen in me before. My answers came with ease, shaped by years of living every detail. When the questions slowed, Victoria rested her chin on her hand. She said softly, "I saw 2 versions of you in less than 24 hours. The ghost at a family table erased by those who should have lifted you, and the leader sitting here commanding a room. I know which version deserves my respect." The words struck deeper than I expected, and I swallowed hard. Steadying myself, Victoria glanced at her assistant who had been monitoring news alerts. A new headline had just gone live. She projected it onto the screen. Forbes unveils 40 under 40 cover story. There was my face framed with the headline, "From Invisible to Invaluable. How Bianca Jackson Built Prestige Events Without Family Money." Gasps filled the room. Victoria turned back to me with a grin that was almost triumphant. "So they will know now." "Yes," I said, my voice firm. "They will know." At that moment, my phone vibrated in my briefcase. I pulled it out to find it lighting up with dozens of messages. My dad, my mother, Chloe. Missed calls stacked in red. The most recent text was from Chloe. She wrote, "Mom fainted, Dad is furious." Everyone at the club has seen the Forbes article. They are asking why we never said our sister was a CEO. I locked the screen and slid the phone back into the briefcase. My world had shifted in an instant, the truth no longer mine alone to guard. Victoria extended her hand across the table. "Ms. Jackson," she said, "I think we have a partnership to celebrate." Her palm was warm, her grip steady. I shook her hand as cameras from her team flashed, capturing the moment the deal was sealed. The contract lay open on the table, my pen poised above it. I signed my name with the flourish, the ink soaking into paper that represented not just a deal, but vindication. The room erupted in applause, champagne flutes appearing from somewhere, corks popping, laughter echoing. I allowed myself a small smile, but inside my thoughts were already racing. Back in Greenwich, the walls were cracking. In Miami, doors were opening. As I raised my glass to toast the partnership, I could almost hear my phone buzzing again, relentless, demanding. But I no longer flinched. The balance of power had shifted, and I was no longer the silent daughter. I lifted the glass, the bubbles rising like a promise, and let the taste of victory settle on my tongue. The storm behind me was far from over, but for the first time, I was ready to face it on my own terms. The morning after the contract signing, sunlight spilled across the resort balcony, sharp and golden against the waves. My phone was heavy in my hand before I even unlocked it. The notifications seemed endless, a blur of messages from my family, former classmates, even distant relatives who had ignored me for years. The Forbes cover had gone live overnight, and the photo of me standing tall in my navy blazer was already everywhere. I scrolled through the headlines, each one sharper than the last, from invisible to invaluable. How Bianca Jackson built prestige events without family money. My stomach tightened as I read the quotes, words I had spoken to the reporter months ago now echoing across the internet. My family assumed I was unemployed. It was easier to build an empire in silence than to fight their assumptions. By the time I reached the end, my phone rang with my dad's number flashing on the screen. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but something in me wanted to hear his voice to measure his reaction. I answered, and silence filled the line before he spoke. His voice was lower than I remembered, stripped of the booming authority he always carried. He asked if it was true. I told him yes. He said he had known in some distant way that I was doing something beyond cooking, but that your mother was so certain, Bianca. She told everyone you were struggling. I should have corrected her. His voice cracked, the faintest tremor of shame slipping through. I listened, torn between anger and the ache of finally being seen. He said the country club was buzzing, that people were calling to ask how he could not know his own daughter was on the cover of Forbes. I asked him if he wanted an answer for them or for himself. He did not reply. Elaine's number appeared next, then Chloe's, both ignored. Instead, I pulled open the curtains and let the Miami air rush in. My team had gathered in the lobby for a celebratory brunch, and I joined them, the clatter of silverware and laughter filling the air like music. Maria hugged me hard, tears in her eyes, as she whispered that we had done it. James raised a glass, calling me the reason their children had brighter futures. Their pride wrapped around me, stronger than any apology my family might stumble through. By midday, I sat with Victoria in a quiet corner of the terrace, overlooking the pool where children splashed under the winter sun. She leaned forward, her expression curious. She told me she had called my mother after the dinner disaster, that she had confronted her about the lies. She described the sound my mother made when she revealed I was her new partner. She laughed softly, shaking her head, saying she had never seen a woman so unprepared for truth. Then she grew serious. She told me she had seen women like me before, women who carried the weight of being underestimated until the world finally caught up. She said my story mattered not just for my company, but for the people who would see themselves in it. I felt the words sink deep, heavier than champagne or applause. Later that afternoon, Chloe finally broke through with a voicemail that made my hands shake. She accused me of humiliating them, of orchestrating the entire thing to destroy their reputations. Her voice wavered between fury and desperation as she begged me to speak with our dad before Mom collapsed completely. I played it twice, then slipped the phone into my bag. Their unraveling was not mine to manage. For years, I had carried their weight bent under their expectations. Now the weight was gone, and they were left to face the truth without me holding it steady. That night back in my suite, I opened a letter I had written months earlier but never sent. It was addressed to myself, a reminder I had penned during the hardest days of building prestige. It said, "You are not invisible. You are not what they say. You are building something bigger than their blindness." I folded the paper and set it on the nightstand, my heart steady. When I turned off the lights, the ocean whispered against the shore. My phone buzzed again in the darkness, lighting up the room with another call from home. I did not answer. I let the sound fade, replaced by the steady rhythm of waves. For the first time in years, I slept without dread, knowing the storm at home could no longer touch the life I had created here. Morning came with another flood of headlines, this time with Victoria's LinkedIn post announcing our partnership. The photograph of me signing the contract with her team spread quickly. Hundreds of comments praising resilience, strength, determination. Former clients chimed in, recounting their experiences with prestige events. The story had taken on a life of its own, one I no longer needed to defend. As I scrolled through the responses, a final message appeared from my mother. It was just 2 words, "We need it." I stared at the screen, my breath caught somewhere between anger and sorrow. The message felt incomplete, but perhaps it was the most honest thing she had ever written. I locked the phone and slipped it into my bag. The truth was, out the world was watching, and my family's reckoning had only begun. 3 months passed before I agreed to meet them. The message from my dad had been steady, never angry, never demanding, simply asking for a chance. At first I ignored him, then I let the silence stretch, testing his patience. But when his voice finally cracked on a voicemail, saying he was ashamed for never speaking up, I felt something inside me shift. We met in a quiet restaurant on the Upper West Side, far from Greenwich and the country club, a place where the walls were brick and the lighting was warm. I arrived early, my nerves knotted, my hands smoothing the sleeve of my navy blazer. When they walked in, I barely recognized them. My dad looked smaller, his shoulders bent. Elaine had lost the sharpness in her eyes, her face drawn and pale. Chloe trailed behind them, her confidence stripped, her gaze lowered. We sat at a round table in the corner. For a long moment, no one spoke. The clink of glasses and low chatter around us filled the silence. Finally, I placed a single sheet of paper on the table. "These are my terms," I said, my voice calm. They leaned in. The paper listed 5 points: equal respect or no contact, no more servant treatment, public acknowledgement of my success. A genuine apology, not just words. Therapy, both family and individual. Non-negotiable. Elaine's eyes filled with tears. She whispered that they had lost everything: the country club's favor, her seat on charity boards, Chloe's biggest clients. She said the phone hardly rang anymore, that people whispered when she walked into rooms. "That's not my responsibility," I told her. My dad cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly around the water glass. "We're not here to blame you, Bianca," he said softly. "We're here to ask for another chance." Chloe finally looked at me, her eyes red. "I was jealous," she admitted, her voice low. "Mom made me feel special by making you small. I see now how sick that was." She added that she had started therapy, that her therapist said their family system always needed a scapegoat, and I had been given that role before I could even fight it. Elaine reached across the table but stopped short of touching my hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "not just for Christmas Eve, but every year I turned you into a servant because I couldn't stand the idea that you might be more successful than the life I planned for you." I studied their faces, worn and humbled, and I felt both anger and a strange sadness. I told them I would consider it, but they needed to know that if we rebuilt anything, it would be as equals, not as master and servant, not as favored and forgotten. My dad nodded quickly, relief flickering across his features, and I added, "If you ever want prestige events to cater anything, you'll be paying full price." For the first time in months, Elaine gave a small, rueful smile. "Fair," she whispered. The waiter came by to take our orders, and the weight of the moment softened for a breath. We spoke quietly over dinner, haltingly at first, then with more ease as the food filled the silence. My dad told me he had resigned from the club, saying he no longer wanted to chase approval from people who had abandoned them at the first sign of scandal. Chloe spoke about restructuring her firm, about trying to rebuild with honesty instead of polish. But when the plates were cleared, I leaned forward again. I told them I was not coming back to the same family, that if they wanted a relationship, it would be on new terms. They nodded, all 3 of them, and for once I believed they meant it. 6 months later, I hosted them in my apartment for the first time. The 2-bedroom condo with a view of Central Park had never seen them step inside before. My team from Prestige Events catered the dinner, uniformed and professional, while I sat at the head of the table. The role reversal was sharp, almost surreal. As plates of seared salmon and roasted vegetables were served, my staff addressed me as boss, their respect natural and unforced. My parents exchanged glances but said nothing. Chloe studied the artwork on my walls, the photographs of events lining the hallway. For the first time, they seemed to see me clearly. I raised a glass of wine and looked around the table. "This isn't about revenge," I said. "It's about the truth. Success doesn't need permission. Respect is not negotiable." Elaine nodded, her eyes lowered. She had already stood before the country club weeks earlier and admitted she had been blind to me, blind to my work, blind to my worth. It had not restored her reputation, but it had begun to repair something fragile between us. Chloe had asked humbly and without entitlement if Prestige might consider her firm for public relations. I told her to submit a proposal like any other company. She did, and it was good. My board and I were considering it not because she was my sister, but because she had earned the chance. My dad had become my quiet supporter, introducing me now as my daughter, the CEO. His pride no longer rang hollow. As dessert arrived, the sound of laughter from my staff echoed from the kitchen. My parents listened uneasy but silent, as the people I employed shared inside jokes. For years I had been invisible in their house. Now they sat in mine, and every detail of the evening reminded them who I had become without them. The night ended without ceremony, just coats pulled on and brief hugs exchanged at the door. But as I watched them leave, stepping into the cold New York night, I knew something fundamental had shifted. They had seen me not as the daughter who cooked in the shadows, but as the woman who built her own table. I closed the door softly behind them and leaned against it, the city lights twinkling through the window. My heart was steady, my breath even. For the first time in years, I felt the story of my life was fully mine, not theirs to dictate. The phone buzzed on the counter with new messages from clients, opportunities already rolling in. I left it unanswered, savoring the quiet, knowing the next chapter was about to begin. The quiet wrapped around me as I stood in my apartment, the lights of Central Park glittering just beyond the glass. My parents' footsteps had faded down the hall, and the hum of the elevator carried them away. I closed my eyes for a long breath, feeling the weight of the years fall from my shoulders. My story was no longer tied to theirs, it was my own. The following weeks moved quickly. Prestige events expanded faster than I could have imagined. The Summit Global contract had opened doors with other Fortune 100 companies, and suddenly my calendar was filled with proposals, interviews, and speaking invitations. Every time I stepped into a boardroom or onto a stage, I carried the quiet memory of my dad's voice calling me nothing more than a MAID. It no longer stung, it fueled me. In February, I stood at a podium at Cornell's School of Hotel Administration, my alma mater that I had never attended because my parents thought it was too ambitious. The auditorium was filled with students scribbling notes as I spoke about building success without permission. I told them that respect is not something you beg for, it is something you embody. I told them that rejection can be the most powerful foundation for resilience. When the applause filled the room, I felt a part of me heal. Later that spring, the Food Network documentary aired, Invisible to Invaluable. It followed me through the kitchens, the offices, the late-night planning sessions. It told the story of a woman who was dismissed by her own family and yet built something enduring. My phone buzzed with messages from strangers across the country, women who said they finally felt seen, women who said they had been underestimated and now felt stronger. Those messages mattered more to me than any contract. My family was still in therapy, or so Chloe told me when she called one evening. Her voice was softer, now humbled. She said she had signed 2 new clients by herself, no tricks, no borrowed reputation, just her own work. She asked if I might consider giving her firm a small contract, not as a favor, but as proof she was ready. I told her to send a proposal the same as before. We both laughed lightly, and for the first time in years, there was no bitterness in our exchange. My mother was slower to change. She reached out sparingly, her words careful. Once she sent me a clipping from the local paper with my face on the cover, a quiet acknowledgement that she was paying attention. She still carried the weight of shame, but at least she was no longer pretending I did not exist. My dad called more often, never long conversations, just brief updates or simple pride. He introduced me now without hesitation as my daughter, the CEO, and I knew it mattered to him, even if the words came late. One night in May, I hosted another dinner in my apartment. This time it was not for family, but for my team, the people who had believed in me before the world ever did. Maria sat at my right, James at my left, the table filled with laughter and clinking glasses. They toasted to the growth, to the future, to the woman who had pulled them along even when the odds seemed impossible. I lifted my glass and told them that they were the reason Prestige was more than a company, that together we had built a community where no one was invisible. When the night wound down and the last of the laughter faded into the city, I stood alone at the window. The skyline glowed alive and steady. I thought of the girl I had been standing in my dad's kitchen, carrying trays with bowed shoulders. I thought of the woman I had become, standing tall in boardrooms, commanding respect I had once been denied. The truth was clear. Success had not been revenge. Success had been liberation. Revenge was the shadow, but freedom was the light. And in that light, I finally saw myself fully. I want to ask you something as I close this chapter of my life. Have you ever been underestimated by the very people who should have lifted you up? Have you ever felt invisible until you chose to make yourself seen? Share your story with me in the comments. I read them all and I promise you your voice matters here. If this journey resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe and stay with me for more stories of justice, resilience, and the kind of victories that change everything. Know your worth. And then add tax.